Hey, good afternoon. There's an old saying in the entertainment industry, which is never follow a passionate Norwegian. I should have not let them have me close after the minister. I feel like I need a much better act. No, I love what you said, Minister. I thought that was very. I wish more countries actually had development ministries and not tiny little aid agencies like ours. And I wish more senior governmental officials were as passionate as you are about creating social justice through environmental sustainability. It's really, really inspiring. Let's see. Well, why am I here? You know, outside my day job, I grew up in a household of serious conservationists, and my father founded the Nature Conservancy's China Country program, and founded the Grand Canyon Trust, and ran the Wilderness Society's public policy programs back in the 80s. So I literally kind of grew up at his feet learning about a lot of these things. One of my professors at Yale School of Environmental Studies was Gus Speth, the former head of the UNDP, and a great mentor of mine. And it's just remained a passion of mine. For the last 10 years, I've been working on a specific community development and conservation project in southern Kenya, which I'll talk about in a second. And just for the last 3 years ago, I agreed to serve as the United Nations Ambassador for Biodiversity. There had been people attached to the environment program and development program, but there hadn't been specific advocates, public advocates for the Convention on Biodiversity and its interrelationship with the development program and the environment program. And so I've worked with the Secretariat on the Convention of Biodiversity, as well as a lot of our friends at UNDP and UNEP on implementation of the tenets of the Convention on Biodiversity through the funding agencies of UNDP and UNEP. I think the reason that Mike and others asked me to talk today was that you know, a lot of this stuff is very high concept. A lot of it ends up being talked about in rooms like this, but I think a lot of people are really curious what it actually looks like on the ground. And some of us know what the challenges are of turning this into a reality. A lot of it's been talked about as a market challenge, as a process of persuading the markets that creating the incentives, creating the regulatory incentives or the voluntary incentives for bringing these markets to scale. But you know, I think it's obviously equally important for people to have conviction that these projects can be implemented on the ground, and that we have a sense of what it looks like when the finance part of it reaches the ground, and that it penetrates, that it reaches real people, that it really creates resiliency. And so because we've been developing a project in and around our broader holistic efforts, these guys asked me just to you know, give you guys a snapshot. So I just want to provide a snapshot of what a project in development looks like and what the impacts of it we hope will be. I guess, you know, the first thing that I would say, well, I'll save that for the end. I think this organization, the Masai Wilderness Conservation Trust, was started around 13 years ago. I got involved with it around 12 years ago. And it was a very inspiring, very Quixote-esque almost effort by a young Italian conservationist who was very passionate about African wildlife, and a young Maasai tribal leader who had a very prescient sense of the need for his community to start finding economic baselines other than cattle, which were increasingly being subjected to the swings of intensifying drought and cattle markets and things like that. And these guys, who really deserve the credit for building this organization, got together and founded a community-based trust to promote sustainable economic alternatives for the Masai communities in southern Kenya based in natural resource, innovative natural resource management. And 12 years later, last year at the Rio Plus 20, MWCT was one of the first community organizations in the world to win both the UNDP Equator Prize and the UNEP Champion of the Earth Prize in the same year, which I think speaks to one of the really important themes that's being discussed here, which is that these are no longer parallel agendas. They are absolutely interlocked agendas, and that I think the reason we got complimented with those awards was that MWCT sits very squarely at the intersection between human well-being, development, economic resiliency, and promoting ecological resiliency and wise natural resource management. MWCT's approach has always been a multi-dimensional, holistic approach, in the sense that what we're essentially doing is working in a context in which an ecosystem that would be defined certainly as iconic, but also a critical ecosystem by any, CI or Nature Conservancy or World Bank, anybody would define the ecosystem that we work in as a critical ecosystem in the critical ecosystem portfolio. Let me just skip through the pretty pictures. This is what's more relevant. Where we work, that's Kilimanjaro National Park down here on the lower left. That's Amboseli National Park, the little green thumbnail. And then that's the massive Tsavo West and Tsavo East parks. And then just there, clipping into the red boundary, the green there is the Tulu Hills National Park of Kenya, which, for those of you with literary passion, that's Hemingway's Green Hills of Africa. That's where he wrote The Green Hills of Africa and the Snows of Kilimanjaro. So this larger ecosystem, which is generally called the Amboseli-Tsavo ecosystem, is an ecosystem of about 7.5 or 8 million acres, bifurcated with its ecologically protected zones of Amboseli, the Tulu, and Tsavo, actually, ironically, spread on the perimeter of an ecosystem, the heart of which is all that white area in the center, which is about 1.5 million acres of land owned outright as entitled land ownership by Masai tribal group families, group ranches. So here you have this rather remarkably almost textbook. I remember the first time that I shared this project with Pavan Sukhdev. He kind of said to me, "You almost couldn't construct a narrative that's a better example of a place where natural resource management decisions and the economic impacts it's going to have on communities have a huge downstream impact on national economic priorities, etc." And just to give a quick sketch of why, first off, Amboseli National Park, Tsavo East and Tsavo West are each alone in the top 5 revenue earners in all of Kenya's tourism market. As a block, they are the largest single revenue block of all of Kenya tourism. The most gate entrances of any national parks in Kenya. You're talking many, many hundreds of millions of dollars a year between public sector and private sector revenues. And all of that is wildlife tourism, so it's all a biodiversity economy, if you want to call it that. The entire migratory system of the Amboseli-Tsavo system relies on movement between Amboseli National Park, the Tulu Hills, and Tsavo. David Western estimated that over 80% of the plains game of Amboseli and all the famous elephants spend over half the year outside Amboseli National Park in the Maasai group ranches. The corridor between Amboseli National Park and Tsavo has been identified by groups like AWF as one of the most important and threatened wildlife corridors in the world. And so you have apart from any warm and fuzzy feelings we may have about animals, you have a massive national tourism economy that's fundamentally reliant on retaining the integrity of that migratory system, and whether or not that system retains its integrity is entirely reliant on whether the Masai decide to farm the land between Amboseli and Tsavo. The fact that they're nomadic cattle pastoralists has remarkably played a huge role in retaining the integrity of that system, because they don't fence it, they don't subdivide it, and they don't farm it. But that's changing under pressure, under water pressure and drought pressure. More and more farming is encroaching on that, and so it's a very unsustainable model, and lots of people are very concerned about the long-term future. Not to mention that this is the epicenter of the current ivory poaching and rhino poaching epidemic in Kenya. So you have all kinds of pressure on wildlife, and pretty much the stewards and the ultimate deciders of how that critical center of the ecosystem is going to get used are these Masai landowners. Second of all, the Tulu Forest, even though it's small, is a very dense and very effective rain cropping device, which feeds down through the young volcanic rock of the Tulu Hills and into a very famous spring in Tsavo National Park called Mazima Springs, which, for those of you who know East Africa at all, in addition to being the place where Alan Root used to shoot all his hippo films, Mazima Springs supplies about 40 to 50% of the fresh water for Mombasa, which is the second largest city in Kenya. So you have about 7 million downstream dependents on the watershed that's fed by the Tulu Forest, and over 50% of the Tulu Forest lies within 2 Masai group ranches on the west side there. So, you know, you've got a very substantial national economic and resource dependency on an area that's actually controlled. The fate of it is going to be controlled by very, very few people. Those people are poor, they're under a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressures. There's Chinese mining contracts being offered. There's timber contracts being offered. There's, you know, there's all the normal things that can drive people to make a choice to create a short-term economic resiliency that is going to have a long-term degradation and collapse. So the question that MWCT tried to identify is, you know, how do we collateralize, how do we monetize in a sustainable way the abundant resources of biodiversity, forest, migration corridors, all of it, and make it into an actual economic portfolio. We've been addressing that lots of ways, working with tourism partners to create mechanisms for passing on community wildlife protection surcharges for each person per night that stay at lodges in the Amboseli-Tsavo area. There's very persuasive modeling that shows that if the tourism industry will not even have to bear that external cost, but will pass that external cost in a very nominal way through the volume of their guests, that you can fund community-based employment of anti-poaching and wildlife protection services throughout the AT ecosystem. We've been working with the Aga Khan family and the Serena hotels to lead on that, and it's pretty clear that there's a very plausible way of having the tourism industry pay not just for the services they get inside the parks, but for the necessary community-based wildlife protection outside the parks, where actually most of the poaching and threat to wildlife is taking place. So we're working with the tourism industry. We're looking at some of what the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, has done with ecosystem trust funds. We've built a Masai Conservancy Trust Fund and are raising a trust fund to fund the acquisition of large conservancy parcels, not purchasing them from Masai landlords, but offering them competitive per acre payments for management agreements on critical pieces of the migration corridor, wetlands and grasslands reserves. Though ultimately will have to be raised through philanthropic funding, the goal is to create a long-term annuity mechanism for these communities to be able to get substantial annuities for making conservancy management decisions. And then finally, we've been working on a carbon credit project to package the carbon of the Tulu Forest and broker that. That obviously is a a multi-stakeholder project. If you just look at this map, this isn't a very good depiction of exactly the different communities, but the community that MWCT started all its work with, the Kuku Group Ranch, is outlined in red there. Just for some perspective, this is one single Masai community that has the titled ownership of 5 times the acreage of Amboseli National Park. The adjacent Group Ranch is 6 times the acreage of Amboseli National Park. So, and Amboseli National Park, for all of its fame and iconic stature, is essentially a thumbnail on the end of the ecosystem that will turn into a dust bowl the instant that those people decide they're going to farm their land. So incentivizing them to be stewards of the health of the ecosystem is obviously going to be very important for the famous elephants that Cynthia Moss studies in Amboseli. But you know, we had an interesting experience. We're a small community-based organization. We have some great partners in Conservation International and the Zoological Society of London, and some great companies like AECOM that have given us a lot of pro bono help. But we had literally almost zero capacity, really, to dig into what it meant to build a carbon project. We tried to rally people in the ecosystem to a conversation about it, and hosted a couple years ago sort of a carbon summit out there in Kuku, and it was really interesting. I think, having grown up, as I said, the son of an NGO conservationist, I kind of assumed that we would ultimately want to partner up with a nonprofit organization. But we heard about this project over in the Kasigao corridor called Rukinga, where a company called Wildlife Works had done a very successful carbon project, registered one of the first REDD Plus projects in the world, and we thought, well, they're in our ecosystem, we should invite them over. To make a long story short, they made a presentation that was so impressive that even like these Masai chiefs who were like 67 years old were coming up and going, those are the guys who know what they're talking about, that's who we want to work with. Apparently almost everybody has more faith in the private sector, so that's great. So we ended up, we partnered with Wildlife Works. It took a little while. It took a little bit of lifting because you have a whole host of different communities: Masai on the west side, Wakamba on the east side, plus Kenya Wildlife Service, which obviously has jurisdiction over the park. You know, it's a complex project because it's multi-stakeholder, but for that reason, it's very exciting. And we've successfully moved to an MOU between all these parties, with Wildlife Works as our leader on it. And actually, just this past month, the training sessions have started throughout the project area. And we're moving through our PDD process toward validation, we hope, early next year. So, you know, what kind of impact would this have? I mean, just without throwing loose numbers around, you know, everything that MWCT does in its sector, we do for about $1.5 million a year, and that includes education and health program implementation. We run 120 community rangers working under Kenya Wildlife Service deputization. We have a lot of programs that employ a lot of people. We employ over 250 people from the local community now, more teachers than the government, more doctors than the government, and it's a very substantial economic engine delivering dividends out through multiple ways. Up to now, we've funded that unsustainably, if you want to call it that, through philanthropic fundraising. We have terrific partners in the Gates Foundation and a number of other private funders, but ultimately, you know, we have to get off that. This really has to become a self-sustaining enterprise if it's going to really mean anything, and we're trying to patch that together. Is the carbon project going to solve that financial equation? No, it's not. It's not going to solve it, but I think it's wrong to look to it to solve it. It's going to play a very substantial role. I think by our loose estimates, the revenue from a Tulu Hills carbon project could provide easily a third to even a half of MWCT's implementation budget, operational budget annually. And that the transformative effect of that on a community of less than 20,000 people is really substantial. You know, the ability to fund programs that are underserved in terms of government services in health and education, the ability to employ people in conservation-related jobs, the ability to sort of leverage ongoing interest in other models like the Land Conservancy. This is a very substantial opportunity for these communities to not just achieve economic resiliency, but by achieving economic resiliency, actually achieve cultural resiliency. Because most Masai that we work with out there, they're very sophisticated guys and very sophisticated women, and they're transactional like the rest of us. They understand the pressures that are on them very thoroughly, and mostly what they want is the ability to remain Masai while making certain adaptations in their livelihood structures that can support the retention of their more traditional cattle-based culture. And you know, the threats to their culture actually come more from the subdivision of land that comes through the adoption of farming than it does through almost anything else. More Masai communities have been sort of decimated culturally by the move toward farming and the subdivision of land that comes with that, the loss of community land ownership structures and joint cattle practices, all these things. The essence of the way they live their lives, which they're very eager to retain on a cultural level, will be deeply supported by the ability to be more economically resilient through tourism revenues, through carbon revenues, through land conservancy leases, you know, a good portfolio like all of us want to have as our nest eggs as well. And I think it's very exciting. This is all really within reach. It's not. This is not. A lot of this is happening now. The carbon project we believe is going to happen, right, Mike? It is going to happen, right? Yes, thumbs up. Mike Korchinski says it is going to happen. But we absolutely will end up relying on the types of people like Microsoft, you know, Ophelia, BNP Paribas, all of the corporate players that are leading on these issues. We will need to take this to market and find people who are excited about the sort of triple bottom line investment that it represents. But I think that it has a real face. You know, it has a real these are the types of trees. That's actually one tree. It looks like it, but it's a 400-year-old straggler fig tree up in the forest, which the Masai think is the ladder that their god climbs down on to come and visit them. Those are the kinds of trees that are cropping all that water and are getting preserved by this project. And this is kind of what it looks like. You know, this is Luca Belpietro is the Italian who started this project, and that was the original community of the young guys who got around together with him to figure it out. To me, you know, when they gave the UN Champion of the Earth Prize at Rio to Samson Parashina, the young Masai guy who started this with Luca, he was the only guy who received. He was the only recipient out of 6 Champions of the Earth Prize who didn't have 2 PhDs. Everyone else had 2 PhDs, and I thought that was really exciting because I think if let me see if I have a picture of Samson. There's Samson, UNEP Champion of the Earth Prize winner. He, to me, if we're not aligning behind guys like Samson, then we're doing something wrong. I think when people who have choices available to them in terms of how they're going to move their communities forward and deal with the pressures on them, who see the problem, see the solutions, and are electing to make those moves, we have to get the resources together behind them and support that, because that to me is the front lines of all of this kind of high-level talk. That's what the front lines really looks like, and that's where it has to work. So that's it, really. I suppose I could answer some questions, but I think we're probably out of time.